thanking the organizers of this tremendous conference and also the participants. I have a lot of time today to hear what is going to be said, and I think you will agree by the end of the day that this is a very vibrant field, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that ensues. So the format here is that I will briefly introduce the panelists for the first panel, and then each will have about 20 minutes to speak to the themes outlined in the conference program. And then I'll give a short commentary, and thereafter we'll open the floor to questions. So our first presenter is Gábor Kádár, and he's a senior historian at the Hungarian Jewish Archives, and he was Charles H. Revson Foundation Fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, right here where we are now, from 2003 to 2004. He's the author and co-author of 5 monographs and numerous studies regarding various aspects of the Holocaust in Hungary, including the recently published book, which is available upstairs. You might have seen it as you came in, The Holocaust in Hungary, Evolution of a Genocide. With that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Gábor.
Thank you very much, Professor Case, and thank you very much for Professor Braham and Dr. Shapiro for putting together this very important event, and thank you all for coming. As Holly mentioned, I spent quite a few research visits in the museum, and I do have very close professional ties with the institution that also had a tremendous impact on my personal life. So when Randy and Paul invited me, I felt like the mothership was calling me home. So it's really great to be back. As you know, this 70th anniversary of the Holocaust in Hungary is in the focus of serious memory policy debates in Hungary and outside of Hungary. We all know that's what's on stake is how a nation, how a political community reflects on its past. So I decided to talk about a historical phenomenon today, a topic that is virtually non-existent in the public discourse in Hungary and in the international public discourse outside of Hungary. As you know, in the 19th and the 20th century, Hungary saw some really dramatic rises and some epic fails in its history. Its political structure and form of government changed many times. It started off as an oppressed state, and state oppressed by the Habsburg, and then it became a regional power within the framework of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, just to become a republic and then a communist dictatorship, a right-wing autocratic state, then a Nazi puppet state, a republic again, and then a Stalinist but ever-softening communist dictatorship until '99, when it became a parliamentary democracy. Throughout these dramatic changes, the level, the form, and the parties of social and inter-ethnic conflicts varied significantly. Various governments applied various policies and even violent actions against various groups. Just a few examples: in the revolution of 1848-49, the Hungarians, the Serbs, the Croatians, and the Romanians fought a bitter ethnic war. During the Second World War, the Hungarian Nazis persecuted the Roma, and after the Second World War after 1945, the Hungarian government organized the expulsion of 200,000 ethnic Germans with the charge of collaborating with the Nazis. Despite all these tragic consequences that emerged from these actions, none of them actually created a permanent historical pattern. But this is exactly what happened with anti-Semitic mass violence in Hungary, which runs through this period, 19th and 20th century Hungary, as a bloody leitmotif. Between the two great revolutions, 1848 and 1956, several hundreds of anti-Semitic attacks, pogroms, assaults occurred in Hungary. Let me just... You can see what... I'm sorry. Okay. In this slide, you can see what this general pattern actually entails. It seems as though whenever power vacuum situations emerged, whenever a system change, an economic conflict situation emerged, then the events took the same spin. Namely, thousands of people started and erupted in anti-Semitic riots. Every volatile social and political situation in this period, or almost every one of them, was accompanied by some sort of anti-Semitic violence. To move to the actual events, you can see how these waves of violence followed each other. The first one in this period, 1848, was of course hallmarked by the great anti-Habsburg revolution and anti-Russian freedom fight. In the first 2 months of the revolution, at least 30 cities saw anti-Semitic mass violence throughout the country. Also, dozens of cities and counties demanded the expulsion of the Jews. The perpetrators came from all ethnic groups: Hungarians, Germans, Slovakians, even Croatians, and also from all layers of society, such as laborers, such as peasants, urban and agricultural population. Now, the new Hungarian authorities tried to defend the Jews to the greatest extent that they could. Many times, the army had to be employed in the certain areas to try to oppress the anti-Semitic violence, and also government commissioners were sent to cities that demanded the expulsion of the Jews. The next wave of violence erupted in the early 1880s. That was what Professor Braham referred as the golden era. In Hungarian Jewish historiography, this is called the golden era due to the emancipation of the Jewish population and due to that tremendous input into the modernization of the country. This was a time of a major transformation, political, social and economic transformation. That was the time when the post-feudal conditions were transformed into a modern capitalist state. And this economic transformation had many losers. And of course, there's many winners and many losers. And the frustration and the anxiety of the losers of this process focused on the Jews, who were seen as the main architects of the capitalist transformation. Starting in 1881, more and more anti-Semitic violent actions happened, but the anti-Semitic violence flooded over the country only in the wake of the so-called Tisza blood libel case in 1882-1884. After that, at least 200 locations, cities and villages saw anti-Semitic activism of all kind, even deadly pogroms. As we saw it in the previous case, the army had to be employed in many cases. In certain counties, actually, civil administration was suspended and the army had to be sent in. Martial law was introduced to stop the rioting. The hotbed of the anti-Semitic violence was northwestern Hungary and southwestern Hungary. These were the areas where most of the action happened. The tremendous changes of 1919 and 1920 also saw consecutive waves of anti-Semitic violence. Already at the end of the First World War, there were instances when the population, angered by food supply problems and angered by actually the threatening famine, attacked the Jews and plundered them. But the real violence broke out after the fall of the Austro-Hungarian state in November 1918. When law and order evaporated, when the state basically collapsed and ceased to exist, then the Hungarian countryside descended into chaos. Soldiers just moving back from the front en masse, and poor agricultural and urban population attacked the Jews when this happens took place. During the communist regime, Jews were also persecuted to a certain extent, not as Jews, but as representatives of social layers that the communist state saw as enemies, such as capitalist and bourgeois layers, of course. But this was just a prelude to the swell of anti-Semitic violence that swept over the country in the wake of Miklós Horthy's coming to power in 1919-1920. That was the first phase when the state or the authorities, so to say, did not oppress, did not go against the anti-Semitic violent acts, but actually encouraged them and tolerated them. Most of the anti-Semitic acts here were committed by the members of paramilitary organizations. However, it would be a mistake to think that the local population stayed away from the violent waves. We know at least 40 cases when the local population, without the help of the paramilitary units, attacked the Jews. That includes such deadly pogroms as the Celdenberg or the Tapolca pogrom. About the Holocaust era, I'm going to talk a little bit later. Let's just go to 1946. According to Laszlo Csőszi's research, between 1945 and 1948, 250 anti-Semitic incidents or incidents in which anti-Semitism played a role happened. Almost 20 of them escalated into mass murder, mass plunder, and robbery. If we take a look at the time frame when it happened, it also gives us a clue why it happened. The anti-Semitic violence of that time reached its peak between February and July 1946. That was the time when the largest inflation in Hungary and in world history hit Hungary, and that was the time when the urban population the agricultural population, especially in the eastern part of the country, actually faced hunger and famine. That was also the time when the question of Jewish assets were really a very serious issue in Hungarian society. What happened, as we know, that the Jewish assets or formerly owned Jewish assets ended up in the hands of non-Jewish Hungarians throughout the Holocaust through many channels. And the survivors who returned home wanted to recover those assets and faced hostility by the local population. Just a quick indication of about the magnitude of the problem. In 1947, there were 100,000 legal cases targeting these issues. And this number indicates only those cases that were actually taken to court. That means that virtually every single Jewish family that returned or every survivor faced a similar issue. The third factor behind this wave of violence was nakedly political. The Communist Party wanted to get rid of a label of a Jewish party, a label that was used by their political opponents on them, also launched a very aggressive political campaign against its political enemies, namely the smallholder party, and organized so-called anti-capitalist and anti-black marketer campaigns. And of course, these two words in certain groups of the Hungarian society immediately triggered anti-Semitic incidents. In 1946, anti-Semitism was a marginal phenomenon in the events of in the revolution of 1956. However, a few of them did happen, and it's important to see that, for example, the Hajdunánás pogrom happened in the time when, again, there was a power vacuum situation, when the old communist authorities were not in place anymore, and the new revolutionary forces, the Nemzetőrség, the so-called National Guard, did not control the situation. Those few days when in Hungary there was this power vacuum situation saw some anti-Semitic acts. Then again, it was a marginal element there. If we take a look at the Holocaust era, we can see that there's lack of mass violence during the Holocaust, and it might be surprising considering what I just mentioned. There's some reasons behind this, and they could include the following. Many Hungarians might have been accustomed to the fact by 1944 that anti-Jewish activity, both legal and violent anti-Jewish activity, is a state monopoly. In 1944, the Hungarian government exceeded even the wildest expectation of the radical anti-Semites by plundering, ghettoizing, and deporting the Jews. And this state-sponsored anti-Semitic violence not only stirred up, but on the other hand also controlled and channeled anti-Semitic sentiments that might have risen in the society. Also, as we have seen in the previous waves of violence, the question of Jewish assets was quite an important one. And in 1944, the systematic plunder was organized by the state itself, and the distribution of the Jewish wealth was organized by the state itself. So there were actually non-violent, quote-unquote, legal means to acquire Jewish assets. But probably the most important factor is that until late 1944, there were no power vacuum situations in the country. So the everyday normality, then again, quote unquote, was not disrupted despite the German occupation and despite the war. Of course, late 1944, after the Eurocross takeover, when the Soviet army invaded Hungary, then the Hungarian state collapsed. And those few incidents that we know about civilian violence against Jews during the Holocaust actually happened in this era. This was just a very brief and very superficial overview of an extremely complex historical issue, and further research must be conducted to really explore the motivations and the operating mechanisms behind this historical phenomenon. For example, we have to find answer to the geographic distribution of anti-Semitic violence. Why is that in certain eras, certain regions were hit harder than, by the anti-Semitic violence than other regions? Also, just let me give you one example. Further research has to explain why, for example, Zala County, which is traditionally used to be a home of a highly integrated Neolog branch of Judaism, and there was a rather small Jewish community, became over and over and over the hotbed of anti-Semitic violence in 1881, 1882, in actually 1848, and also 1990. Another very important element of further research should be international comparison. What happened in Hungary must be interpreted in the context of international events. For example, the pogrom wave of 1881, 1884 must be taken into the context of the Russian and the German events, because these years actually saw anti-Semitic violent actions in Russia and in Germany as well. Obviously, there's some sort of interplay between these events that must be further researched. Also, the lack of anti-Semitic mass violence during the Holocaust must be confronted with the similar issues in Eastern Europe. We know that in Poland, in Lithuania, in the Ukraine, the local population was quite active and was engaged in anti-Semitic mass violence. Comparing these phenomena might give us an answer and might give us an explanation and a better understanding to this quite complicated historical phenomena. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gábor. So our next speaker is Rebecca Klein-Pécsova, who is an assistant professor of Jewish studies at Purdue University, and she is the author of Mapping Jewish Loyalties in Interwar Slovakia, which is a book forthcoming with Indiana University Press. Her recent publications include articles in the Austrian History Yearbook, the AGS Review, and Shofar. So with that, I would like to turn the floor over to Rebecca.
Okay, so first of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference. I'm honored to be here, and I'd like to greet the Jewish community in Budapest. My paper is called Across the Iron Curtain, Hungarian Jewish Refugees in Austria, 1945 through 49. The letters to ends. Population displacement in the early post-war period, in the few short chaotic years between the end of the Second World War and the consolidation of Stalinist dictatorship in a newly defined Eastern Europe, is an important area of new historical research. It reveals afresh the extent of the wartime devastation and the process of post-war European reconstruction. Much of the recent scholarship deals with the international politics of population displacement in the period covered by the mandates of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRWA. This covers the years 1944 through 47, and its successor, the International Refugee Organization, or IRO, which covers the years 1947 through 1952, which was established when it became clear that the refugee problem would not disappear through repatriation. In September 1945, about 1 to 1.2 million people remained displaced in Europe, following the largely successful efforts by the United States military authorities and UNRWA to repatriate the 11 million displaced at the end of the war. They were located primarily in the German occupation zones, which you can see here on the map. The number of displaced persons dramatically increased with the arrival of the approximately 12 million ethnic Germans who fled or were expelled from Eastern Europe. They were followed by opponents of the nascent socialist Eastern European regimes, and then by Polish, Hungarian, Romanian, Czech, and Slovak Jews who did not want to return home. With a mandate for DP care and maintenance, the IRO was born from the shift in goals from repatriation to resettlement. At first, United States military authorities did not recognize Jews as a distinct group to be handled separately, and Jewish DPs were heedlessly housed together with peoples who had persecuted with them during the war. This changed after Earl Harrison's condemnatory report to the American President Truman concerning the mistreatment and poor care of non-repatriable Jews. Jews were then accommodated in separate Jewish camps, which became, according to recent scholarship, sites of identity reconstitution through interaction between the refugees and their administrators. This paper represents a beginning examination of the experience of Hungarian Jewish refugees in the DP camps and centers in Austria as the common border between Hungary and Austria gradually closed. It does so through the prism of contact, drawing in particular on a forgotten cache of undelivered mail addressed to Hungarian Jewish refugees who sojourned at the transient DP camp at Ems, Green Shelter, number 106 in Upper Austria in 1946 and 1947, that came from their relatives and friends in Hungary. The camp at Enns is a fixed point in this story of Hungarian Jews' attempts to map and travel the paths of adaptation to their shattered world. Contact with relatives, friends, and international Jewish organizations like the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the AJDC or Joint, was crucial for understanding the parameters of the post-war world, pondering the constellation of available options, and shaping strategies beyond survival in the consolidating post-war system for Jews in Hungary and abroad. In 1946, there were 30,372 Jewish DPs in Austria. The majority of them, nearly 30,000 people, located in the American occupation zone in Upper Austria. They were the third largest group of Allied DPs after non-Jewish Poles and non-German speakers from Yugoslavia. Former concentration camp inmates and Jewish refugees who arrived in Austria after the war from Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Czechoslovakia made up the Jewish DP population. Having been at home and seen the conditions there, Hungarian Jews who came after the war in the Great Wave of 1946 had no intention of returning. They fled from post-war pogroms or in fear of their imminent outbreak. They fled from post-war antisemitism, from catastrophic economic conditions, including inflation that surpassed that in Germany after World War I, and the social psychological trauma of confronting loss at home. The surviving Jewish population of Hungary is in utter distress, wrote the Budapest branch of the Hebrew Sheltering and Immigrant Aid Society, or HISAM, office describing immediate post-war conditions. Psychologically, only immigration can save them from mental breakdown. Between July and September 1946, the Joint in Austria struggled to meet the needs of the nearly 27,000 Jewish refugees fleeing conditions in Eastern Europe. The influx was unpredicted, supplies of food and clothing were low, and staffing insufficient. The U.S. Army quickly opened 4 transient camps on the outskirts of Linz to handle the influx, including the one at Enns, all of which were soon taxed beyond capacity. The Joint lamented the ridiculously inadequate supplies and how it at first failed hopelessly and completely to meet the demands of the starving, disturbed transient population. By mid-September, the U.S. Army and the Joint reported the situation under control, and the 5 Jewish transient camps were in full operation. Housing and sanitation gradually improved, and people in the camps began to take part in religious and social activities. Some expressed interest in pursuing vocational and educational programs, but morale was very low. The territory of the then American zone in Austria to which Jewish refugees fled was grotesquely familiar. It was the site of concentration camps during the Nazi era, and it was the endpoint of the Hungarian Jewish death marches in early 1945 before liberation. Jewish DPs and refugees in Austria put up a monument to all the Jews who perished during the Nazi regime at Ebensee with funds from the Joint. Dear Lazzi, began a letter to Ems Green Shelter in August 1946. I was glad to receive your letter, and I'm happy to hear you are well. So, you are near the cursed Mauthausen again, where we suffered together. The landscape before you is not unknown. I would also like to visit our former torture chamber once again in my life, but I would like to see our former tormentors suffer through the same as they did to us and ours. It is rather disturbing that even now, after so much suffering, you still have no home. My dear Lazzi, I am going to make inquiries on your behalf through a friend at the Austrian consulate. Shadi Neni writes that they are living in very poor circumstances in Hungary. I am somehow managing. Lazzi never received this letter, and it is probable that he moved on, whether or not with the help of the contact at the Austrian consulate. Enns was a transit camp, and Upper Austria was an undesirable location. Many DPs moved rapidly from Austria to preferred camps and centers in Germany and Italy, the other DP countries. Germany seemed a liberal haven in contrast to conditions in Austria. Politically, the Allies considered Austria a liberated country based on the premise that it was an occupied and unwilling partner of Nazi Germany. They wished to give Austria the chance for democratic development. Yet observers indicated that they had not yet seen any evidence of that development. The necessity of living in Austria for Jews holds no interest or satisfaction. This is a basically hostile, anti-Semitic country, wrote the Joint Field Director. They know too well that the Austrian people resent their very existence here and constantly agitate for their removal. Enns was guarded by the US military and had extraterritorial status. Its inhabitants were housed at a former barracks rather than in huts, which was usually the case, yet the quality of life was low and the camp sometimes suffered from terrible overcrowding. This is an exceptional photograph. Based on the prevalence of Hungarian language materials at Ems in comparison with the other DP camps and centers, statistical data on arrivals, lists of names, and other evidence, including meeting minutes, protocols, and the largely Hungarian language cache of undelivered mail, Enns appears to have been a central gathering point for Hungarian-speaking Jewish refugees in the Austrian DP camp system. Jewish refugees at Enns learned from Hungarian language announcements, for example, that cigarettes would only be distributed between 8 and 9 in the morning, and only to persons who had filed their papers in the main office. Hungarian Jews were active in the Jewish camp leadership at Enns, organizing supplies, work, and issues related to hygienic conditions. Tensions were high at Enns between the Polish Jews and the Hungarian Jews, as the Polish Jews felt that the assimilationists were preferred and get twice as much. while doling out curses against the Polish Jews and occupying all key positions. Nevertheless, Hungarian-speaking Jews, Jews from Hungary, Jews from Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia were all classified within the broader category of Jewish in the DP camp system after the Harrison Report. Their wartime experience and then post-war policy toward them, the aid available to them, including an 800-calorie supplement to their camp diet, the parameters of their post-war fate, the view of the surrounding society, the options before them, and how they shaped their strategies for rebuilding their lives were based upon their classification as Jewish, however they wished to interpret it or act on it. This was a pronounced change for Jews coming from the territory of interwar Hungary, where Jewish had not existed as a category of national declaration, whether counted according to language usage as it had been in Poland or directly as it had been in Czechoslovakia. Unlike Jews elsewhere in interwar East Central Europe, the historically assimilationist Jewish population within the borders of interwar Hungary energetically rejected Jewish as a national category. They wanted to be Magyar. Jewish classification was now a marker used to accommodate their specific needs and concerns by the American occupational authorities and the Joint, which plainly intersected with their own understanding of the real options before them and what path they may beat away from Hungary and away from ends. It represented a rupture in their experience of identification, though it remained primarily a practical and not ideological connection for post-war Hungarian Jewish refugees as they mapped and traveled the paths of post-war adaptation. We do not see explicit references to Jewishness in the Hungarian language letters to Enns, but rather intimate, practical, and emotional responses to their radically and tragically transformed world and attempts to find normalcy within it. We are able to pick up one end of that connection through the dozens of undelivered letters found at Enns, focusing for the purpose of this paper on that exchange with relatives and friends in Hungary in 1946 and 1947. There we see a change in tone in the letters, moving from a wider net of topics, including concerns about the addressee's whereabouts and health, passing on available travel information, news about visas, quotas, conditions, who can help them reach their destination, reports on efforts to be in touch, send packages, take care of promised favors, sending love and kisses, telling about the new babies coming into the world, and how deeply they are missed, to an increasingly concerted effort to entice them to come home. The letter writers hope to pull the refugees home, that is, Hungary. Selected representative passages follow. My dear Ervin, wrote Eva in mid-August 1946 from Budapest, I received 3 of your letters and a card today. I was so anxious and wondering what happened to you and why you did not write. I received a letter today from Bela, too. He writes that when you get there, he will have all the papers you need. If you think I do not miss you, you are very wrong, because I think of you all the time. I do not go anywhere. As we discussed, at noon I always think of you. I was at your mom's the day before yesterday. She was very happy. I ate apple soup, melon, and plum. I think everyone is surprised that you left. I hardly believe it. My dear sweet one, I am worried about you. Do not catch a cold. Take care of yourself. Get some warm things. Do you still have your boots, or did they get destroyed? I washed and ironed your laundry and put it away. Write a lot and fast. Kisses from your Eva. Lajos sent a letter to his Eva from Budapest at the end of August 46. Even after so many attempts to send letters, we still don't know anything for certain. You wrote to us on August 5th, as did Agi. Both letters arrived from Enns, although according to the American telegram that we received, you cannot be there. Now we don't actually know what's going on. Vera brought a baby girl into the world on July 24th. She and the baby are fine. The baby weighed 3 kilos at birth and was 53 centimeters long. Now the little angel is 3.6 kilograms. This shows how healthy she is. There is enough food. Vera has bountiful milk. As for me, I'm somehow managing things. The prices are not cheap, but they are manageable. Dear Jury, wrote Pista from Hajdu Szonboslo near Debrecen in 1946. Unfortunately, I've not been able to fulfill your requests. I was at the post office, but there was no way to send a package. The car is still here. I tried to sell it, but there are no buyers. Unfortunately, it is not possible to get it started because there's no gas. And Polly said it's probably no good anymore since Biro pushed it home. I have the grammar book, but I can't send it. I'm happy to read that our friend has been successful in gaining passage to Australia. Another friend is greeting you. He is going to America in the spring. Very much looking forward to your letter. Write about everything. In early 1947, a letter for László arrived from Budapest. Maybe, my László, you are right and smart, and I should not be selfish and try to persuade you to come back home. If I only knew that you would succeed to get out somewhere, but who knows how long it will take. We are not freezing here because we have enough fuel, we are heating, only that you should not freeze. I mailed a letter on the 11th with 10 cigarettes. It's the most important. Here, a Mr. Korocs wrote to István Dudas of his own return to Erdőbénye in the Tokaj wine region of Hungary in January 47. I received the letter written by Klein, and now I can finally write to you all that I am home, thank God. But I can tell you, on the way here, we experienced many horrible things, but don't worry, I'm pleased to be home. The following passages come from a set of 3 letters to László and Kati from Budapest in early 1947, highlighting the fluidity and terrible uncertainty of the moment. I suggest that you return. Pani did, she is here in Pest. Though Dezső went to Germany, he is coming back, too, and bringing something from there. I say you come back. All the others can make ends meet. You will make ends meet, too. Pani and her family have returned for good. Clary is expecting the baby next month. It is very hard to get to America. I think it is better to create a life here. The situation is always getting better. Mostly careerists go to America, and as far as I know, you do not have such ambitions. America is a capitalist country, and we don't know whether it wants progress or destruction. 15 million Jews live there. I'm afraid there'll be an even bigger Auschwitz. I wish this fear to be a nightmare, but unfortunately we cannot know anything. If you really must go somewhere, go to Palestine. Here there is nothing new. We work hard. We live and are well. There are some good Russian films in the cinema. I am tonight going to see The Stone Flower. And at last, a plea from little Giga. Dear László and Kati, why don't you come home to play with me? I'm so bored. These days, Mom does not let me go anywhere to play. One of my dolls is Piri, the second is Shari, the third is Eva, the fourth and biggest is Yutka. The radio works again. Popi, Giga. As these letters were written, the Cold War intensified. Hungary remained in what has been called a kind of semi-democracy through the summer of 1947, when Stalin shifted strategies, leaving behind patriotic front-style coalition policies. Mátyás Rákosi, the head of the Hungarian Communist Party, had already been preoccupied with the gradual erosion of the non-communist leadership, informally known as his salami tactics. The process accelerated as the police exposed a set of alleged anti-Soviet conspiracies engineered to bring down the popularly elected Smallholders Party. One last multi-party election took place in August 1947, though its results were predetermined to favor a communist win. With communist victory in hand, the other post-war parties were steadily dissolved, save for the Social Democratic Party, which merged with the Hungarian Communist Party in June 1948 to become the Hungarian Workers' Party. By summer 1948, the Iron Curtain was rapidly moving westward, and the State of Israel had come into existence. New York's Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS, was sick at heart over the developments in Poland, a country from which so many Jews would like to emigrate, and was informing itself about the regime change in Czechoslovakia. The Polish premier had already informed HIAS that as an American organization, its activities were viewed with suspicion, and it would be highly desirable for HIAS to discontinue its activities. Legal channels of immigration contracted. Jews from Hungary who now tried to leave the country sought illegal passage through Bratislava to Vienna, a route that remained partially open until mid-1949 with the knowledge of the Hungarian Ministry of the Interior. Yehuda Bauer estimates that at least 30,000 Jews fled from Hungary in 48 and 49 until the semi-legal passage through Czechoslovakia was sealed, and that about 50,000 Jews left Hungary between the end of the Second World War and 1956. Approximately 15,000 to 18,000 of them emigrated clandestinely to Palestine through Bricha organizational channels. Many Hungarian Jews who emigrated to the newly established State of Israel saw it as a step toward eventual settlement in the U.S. The U.S. partially opened its doors in 1948 with the DP Act, which allowed 200,000 DPs in, although only those who had acquired DP status before December 22, 1945. A reform to that law passed in 1950 allowed in further refugees who had acquired DP status by January 1, 1949. The curtain has rung down on calendar year 1949, wrote the Hayes director of Germany and Austria. Hayes sought to place the displaced in 1949, settling the vast majority of DPs in the US, followed with a sharp decrease in number by Canada, Australia, and other countries, many in South America. The intimate and compelling letters from Enns freeze this story of overwhelming rupture, migration, and geopolitical transformation in its tracks. We remember that most of all, after their bare physical needs were met, survivors craved contact. Contact was the thread of continuity, a means of chasing normalcy, of sketching out the terrain and strategies of adaptation to a destroyed world. Written in 1946 and 1947, these letters capture the fluctuations and uncertainties of the years between the end of the Second World War and the drawing down of the Iron Curtain. We hear the letter writers' voices clearly before the survivors' paths diverge.
Great. Thank you. So our final speaker for this panel is László Csősz, who is a senior historian at the Holocaust Memorial Center in Budapest, and he was the Charles H. Revson Foundation Fellow in 2006 and 2007 here at the Holocaust Museum, and the Tzipora Wiesel Fellow at the United States Holocaust Museum from 2013 to 2014, so in fact as we speak. He is the author and co-author of several studies, including the newly published The Holocaust in Hungary, Evolution of a Genocide, together with Gábor, Kádár, and Zoltán Vági, whom you'll be seeing this afternoon. So with that, I'm turning the floor over to László.
Thank you very much, Holly. And I also would like to express my thanks for the organizers for inviting me. As you already know from the introduction, my lecture here is a product of research I've been conducting at the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies in the last few months. So I'm also very grateful for this opportunity. So the title of my presentation is The Origins of the Military Labor Service System in Hungary. The Hungarian institution of military labor service inflicted on Jews and members of various other minority groups is one of the well-documented chapters of World War II and the Holocaust. Scholarly literature described the military labor service system in Hungary as a unique phenomenon, arguing that whereas most of the Axis countries excluded Jews from their armies, the Hungarian authorities compelled them to perform unarmed military service and sent many of them to the front line alongside combat units. The majority of these labor servicemen were Jewish. At least 50,000 Jewish men died as members of the Hungarian forces, comprising about 1/5 of the total casualties of the Hungarian army between 1941 and 1945. Labor servicemen comprised approximately 10% of the estimated 500,000 victims of the Holocaust in Hungary. These facts rendered the problem of labor service to be interpreted exclusively within the realms of military history and Holocaust studies. However, this complex historical problem has several ramifications that might capture the minds of nationalism scholars as well. Holocaust studies have witnessed several methodological and theoretical revolutions and have attracted ever-growing scholarly interest in the last few decades. Considering this fact, it is striking that the early groundbreaking accounts about the Hungarian labor service system are still the standard reference works of the problem. Elek Karsai's source volumes and Randolph Braham's comprehensive monograph thoroughly describe the creation and administration of the system and its turning points during the course of war. Since the publication of these pioneering works, several scholars have authored outlines on the topic and addressed specific aspects of the problem. Most of them trained their lenses on the most murderous periods, namely the fate of the labor servicemen deployed on the Eastern Front and working under German command in the copper mines of Serbia and along the eastern border of the Nazi Empire. Several original publications notwithstanding, Hungarian scholarship on labor service has largely failed to develop or to rethink the interpretative framework of the early masters. No significant attempt to author a comparative study facilitating the extensive international literature on forced labor and labor service exists. Despite certain noteworthy peculiarities, the Hungarian institution of labor service was embedded in and heavily influenced by international trends. Still, there have been only scarce attempts to compare the Hungarian case with the policies of other countries. During and before World War II, several countries in Hitler's Europe compelled various social groups to undertake forced labor or labor service on a discriminatory basis. The cases of the two other opportunistic satellites, as Raoul Hilberg aptly called them, Romania and Bulgaria, are of particular significance to understand the Hungarian system. The political, economic, and social milieu that formulated the policy against various minority groups and therefore determined the evolution of the concepts of labor service followed roughly the same patterns. Of course, one can cite considerable differences and numerous shifts in aims and motivations over the course of the war, but these country-specific differences seem to be outweighed by parallels. In other words, the systems with different structural and operational schemes served analogous political, economic, and social functions. Exploring the origins of the wartime military labor service system, it is essential to place this problem in the broader context of the labor service phenomenon. Originating from 19th century altruistic conceptions of voluntary work in the service of public good, the idea of youth labor camps developed into a socio-political concept, a social movement, and a measure of crisis management after World War I. In the authoritarian regimes of Eastern Europe, state-supported labor service projects developed into militarized and ideological constructions and the instruments of social engineering. Both in Hungary and Romania, these initiatives were spearheaded by ultranationalist youth organizations. Hence, Jews were de facto excluded from voluntary labor service long before such exclusion was sanctioned by law. State policies about civilian labor service played a role in the evolution of the discriminatory forms of military service. During the decision-making process concerning the so-called Jewish question within the army, departments of the Hungarian Ministry of Defense requested and analyzed reports on the main models of the civilian labor camp movement, the German and the Bulgarian labor service. The other formative factor was the long-lasting tradition of anti-Jewish exclusionism in the Hungarian army. The first unarmed military units, organized on the basics of political and racial discrimination, were set up in Hungary in the autumn of 1919 in Miklós Horthy's National Army. When conscription was reintroduced in 1938, army and political leaders were in unison about the specific treatment of the problem of Jewish reservists and recruits. The aggressive nationalism that characterized much of the Hungarian army was further radicalized in the wake of the war crisis and border conflicts. The army gave way to anti-minority discriminatory practices which went beyond the existing laws and decrees or were based on an extended interpretation of them. Scholars scrutinizing wartime military labor service systems can learn much about the ethnopolitical endeavors of nation-states and national communities that created them. The expansionist policies of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union to reshape the political landscape of Eastern and Southeastern Europe between 1938 and 41 activated and catalyzed centuries-long interethnic conflicts. Border disputes and territorial reassignments boosted state violence against ethnic groups considered traditional adversaries. It is no surprise, then, that all key decisions concerning the military service of Jews between 1939 and 41 were connected to the stages of territorial revision. Due to the ultranationalist hysteria and borderland complex of the military elites, various groups of so-called questionable loyalty were excluded from or segregated within the armed forces. These decisions can also be interpreted as attempts of nationalist social engineers to designate the borders of the envisioned national community. Jews, and sometimes Gypsies, became an integral and central component of the enemy's image everywhere. Traditional interethnic conflicts acted as catalysts of anti-Jewish violence, manifested in pogroms and arbitrary actions of military authorities. In the minds of many Axis officers, the categories of communists, Jews, and bandits were closely interwoven. Therefore, on the verge of entering the war, all allies of Germany but Finland excluded Jews from their armies. Furthermore, this measure was applied to all elements of society considered unreliable, including minority groups living on borderlands or in historically disputed territories. However, the nationalistic regimes did not want to leave these groups out of the war effort either. Therefore, various forms of unarmed and penal service emerged. The ranks of Hungarian labor battalions included left-wingers, members of Christian denominations who refused armed service on religious grounds, and some of the ethnic minorities, including Romanians, Southern Slavs, Ruthenians, and Gypsies. Their Romanian and Bulgarian counterparts also applied a set of racial, ethnic, religious, and political categories in pursuing their aim of nationally pure army and society. In Hungary and Romania, all military-age citizens labeled as Jewish by the race protectionist laws were conscripted for labor service, with specific exemptions. Whereas for other targeted groups, this measure was implemented selectively. Bulgarian Jews shared the same fate, but in this country, the discriminatory policies against rival ethnic groups, most of all the Turks, were also of top priority. Therefore, all of these groups were forced into labor service units. However, Turks, Muslim Pomaks, Serbs, and Greeks served in segregated units but under the army. They often suffered the same harsh treatment, but received payment and were not visually stigmatized, unlike the Jews. In Romania, mostly Ukrainians, Bulgarians, and Hungarians were forced into unarmed units. Concepts of military labor service were influenced by the agendas and aspirations of nationalistic political elites about ethnically and racially homogeneous nation-states and changing perceptions of belonging to the national community. The duty and privilege of every able-bodied man to defend his homeland with arms was one of the fundamental criteria of the modern nation-state. Universal conscription symbolized belonging to the political community. Hence, depriving certain social groups of the right to carry arms was one of the first and fundamental steps to degrade them to secondary citizens. Besides social and political disenfranchisement, drafting suspect social groups into unarmed service can also be interpreted as a preventive safety measure. The call-up and separation of able-bodied men renders the targeted social group powerless, blocking their access to weapons, which they could potentially turn against the state and the dominant ethnic group. Moreover, revoking the right to carry arms was a form of humiliation and a reprisal for alleged acts of treachery and disloyalty in the past. Naturally, perceptions and theories of labor service should be interpreted in the general framework of the anti-Jewish policies of the pro-Axis governments. There was a complex interplay between the advocates of racist and nationalistic exclusionism in the army and state policies about definition, deprivation of rights, and the gradual exclusion from society. Arbitrary measures of the military authorities, especially in the Romanian and the Hungarian case, often preceded and exceeded national anti-Semitic legislation, and therefore they served as catalysts of government policies. At the same time, the fundamentally pragmatic and economic motives of the anti-Jewish laws determined the development of labor service systems. These institutions also served as a means of economic exploitation and expropriation, both on the state and the individual level. In addition, the masses of young men who lost their jobs due to Jewish laws posed a safety risk for the anti-Semitic states, but also an unemployment problem to which underpaid or free labor service offered a cheap solution. It should be added that by the time the labor service systems crystallized and were legally established, that is 1941-42, the utmost objective of all the pro-Axis regimes under scrutiny was to expel Jews from the country and nationalize their assets. Therefore, labor service was seen by most of the decision makers as a transient measure. Due to the political domination of the army over this issue, the early period of the Hungarian military labor service system was characterized by strong nationalistic, ideological, and social pedagogical motivations. The system was envisioned as a preventive and punitive measure against Jews and other internal enemies, as well as the venue of so-called physical disciplining and moral education of these groups. In the increasingly dense atmosphere of the Cold War preceding Hungary's entry into the war, radical circles in the Ministry of Defense and the General Staff were striving for the total mobilization of Jewish men despite any pragmatic considerations. However, more realistic and sensible approaches were also present. These generated conflicts within civilian authorities, but also within the structure. For example, military commanders assigned to factories producing for the army protested against the draft of engineers and other experts. Ultimately, the views of the radicals overpowered other considerations. As a result, Hungary became the only country to deploy large numbers of unarmed auxiliary units in combat zones. Bulgarian and Romanian labor service units never operated outside the extended national borders. Hence, their survival rates were much higher, although the general mistreatment of the labor servicemen in the three countries did not diverge. They suffered from malnutrition, insufficient housing and sanitary conditions, harsh discipline, and even brutalities. However, in the context of barbaric warfare and extreme conditions in the Eastern Front, these practices had more deadly consequences. Some Hungarian units turned into mobile killing sites, as one survivor put it, even though the system as a whole was definitely not the part of methodic genocide. Even though strong ideological motivations were also present, Romanian and Bulgarian policymakers prioritized the economic exploitation of the Jewish communities and the utilization of the expertise of Jewish intellectuals and skilled workers for the economy. Military duties of Jewish citizens were transformed into both financial and work duties. In Romania, the military tax could have been as high as 70% of the annual income of a person. Jews were allowed to purchase exemption from service. The Bulgarian national defense law introduced indemnity tax for those who were unfit for hard physical labor. The purchase of exemption was not allowed legally, but in practice many could buy themselves out by giving a bribe. In Hungary, by contrast, exemption was a rarity and mobilization was of utmost priority. At the same time, labor service effectively served as a method of political vendetta and individual vengeance. Call-ups were often performed on an individual basis and based on private demands. This provided an opportunity for the elimination of the leftist and liberal political opposition, critical journalists, and other undesirable intellectuals, business rivals, and also as a way to solve personal conflicts. These factors also worked against the economic efficiency of the system. Priority of economic motivations, therefore, did not necessarily mean rationality. The system was characterized by corruption, nepotism, and bureaucratic anomalies, especially in Romania and Bulgaria. Bribery and unauthorized leave were quite common in these countries. In Romania, more than 200 Jewish officers remained in the army due to administrative faults or hidden identities. In Hungary, a somewhat stronger discipline prevailed, and the forces were more completely purged. On the level of the units, however, the difference was not significant. Blackmail, withdrawal of food and provisions, and outright robbery were commonplace in all the three countries. Due to poor organization, ad hoc strategic planning, and a largely unskilled and physically unfit workforce, the performance of the labor service units was insufficient, with few exceptions. Despite the efforts during the course of war to reorganize and rationalize the systems, these problems prevailed and had negative impact on the national economies. The evolution of the labor service systems also reflected the changes of the external political environment, most of all the turns of the Eastern Allies' troubled relationships with Nazi Germany. The decisions concerning the military service of the Jews before the outbreak of the war were partly the products of domestic developments and partly the concomitants of the German military and political alliance. Due to the different dynamics of anti-Jewish exclusionism attributed to the different socio-economic character and size of the Jewish community in Bulgaria, direct German involvement played a greater role. Romanian and Hungarian decision makers, by contrast, mostly pursued their internally developed anti-Jewish agenda, although influenced by Nazi successes. After 1942-43, changing attitude to the German alliance and the outcome of the war was the decisive factor formulating policies concerning labor service. With the total mobilization for war, all the systems reached their peaks in 1943-44. By this time, as German military and political power was declining, all satellite states reconsidered their Jewish policies. Of course, it also influenced the fate of the labor serviceman. It is ironic that labor service, formulated in a rabidly anti-Semitic context, ultimately became a place of relative safety for many. The majority of able-bodied Jewish men living in the heartlands of the three countries survived the war. Historians often refer to the decisions of Bulgarian and Hungarian authorities as so-called rescue operations to thwart Nazi genocidal plans. The situation was actually more complex. The series of events that eventually saved the lives of labor servicemen were the results of conflicting anti-Semitic policies and the rivalry between and within various levels of the power structure. Neither the Hungarian nor the Bulgarian army was willing to hand over valuable manpower to the Germans. It was probably also the manifestation of anti-Nazi attitudes of some officers. At the same time, both armies introduced strict preventive measures upon the labor servicemen stationed in the country who were still considered internal threat. Deportation of the labor servicemen, in fact, was only suspended. There had been no ultimate decision about their fate, and handing them over to the Germans had remained an option until their countries broke the Axis alliance. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all the panelists for these fantastic papers. I'd also once again like to thank the Holocaust Museum for organizing this conference, to share the greeting that Rebecca extended to those listening in Budapest. And I'd like to particularly thank here at the Holocaust Museum Paul Shapiro, Leah Wolfson, and Nicole Frechette, all of whom have been very instrumental in organizing this conference, which is 2 years in the making. So very heartfelt thanks to them. What I find remarkable about the papers on this particular panel is how they demonstrate the vibrance of this particular field. It is notable not only for the incredible empirical research that's being undertaken both here and at other institutions in Europe and in the United States, but also I think these papers betray a broader interpretive framework, which is a fascinating evolution in Holocaust scholarship in general, but also in Hungarian Holocaust scholarship in particular. So they integrate knowledge from other fields of historical inquiry, other periods, and other instances of mass violence. This conference is about the Holocaust in Hungary, but its insights have broader implications for the study of grassroots and state-sponsored persecution. And these papers show, in various ways, different connections to violence in other parts of Europe, both at the time and across time. So Gábor's paper has both an implicit and an explicit comparison with places like Poland, Ukraine, and Lithuania, where pogrom-type violence took place also during the Second World War. Rebecca's paper is quite international in that it positions the experience of a particular group of Jews in the context of the massive problem of displaced persons in the wake of World War II. And Laszlo's paper engages specifically with the growing theoretical literature on nationalism and includes also explicit comparison to places like Romania and Bulgaria. I think the panelists are very much to be congratulated for thinking in very broad terms about the lessons to be learned from thinking about the Hungarian Holocaust in a broader context. So I'd like to focus my remarks on areas of overlap between the papers and then to pose some questions. I'm not going to then turn the floor over to the panelists just yet. I thought we would collect questions from the audience, a few, in addition to mine, and then we would give them perhaps a couple of goes at sets of questions at the end. So we're coming up upon the 100-year anniversary of the outbreak of World War I, and I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of these papers go back to the period of World War I, at least in part of the analysis that they're discussing. World War I is hugely important, not just in Hungarian history, but in European history as a whole. And it is, in some respects, a less digested history than some of the subsequent periods. And that process of digestion, if it were to start with World War I, might have different results, as one would think then about World War II. So in Hungary's particular case, Hungary's relationship with Austria was incredibly fraught during World War I, including the issue of Hungary's responsibility or lack thereof for the outbreak of World War I, the issue of mobilization, mass mobilization of the Hungarian population, including Hungarian Jews, the disintegration of the Habsburg monarchy, and with it, the disintegration of the Hungarian kingdom or the massive territorial changes that were made to the Hungarian kingdom after World War I, mass migration as well, mass inflation, in addition to the revolution of 1919. All of these are very significant aspects of Hungary's history. They are not unique to Hungary. Other states had comparable experiences, at least or in whole or in part. But a lot of the discussion in Hungary, I think, gets channeled through what happened during and after World War I. So some of the largest narratives of victimization that are operative in the Hungarian political sphere today emerge from this time period. And these two narratives involve, on the one hand, the communists and, let's say, the nationalists. So the big narrative of victimization of the nationalists is Trianon, the trauma that was Trianon. The narrative of victimization of the communist is the failed revolution of 1919 and the clamp down on any sort of leftist activity that took place in the wake of that revolution. And so I would like to pose the question to the panelists: what can scholarship do to offer a counterpoint to the various ideologized interpretations of World War I? Because these ideologized interpretations continue to inform the way that politics operate in Hungary. And scholarship has perhaps a unique role to play in offering a more nuanced, a more complex interpretation, but also dealing very closely with what actually happened on the ground. And so I would like to ask, if we revisit World War I in the context of thinking about the short 20th century, what can scholarship do in that realm? So I'd like to talk a bit about the state role vis-a-vis Jews during the Second World War. Gábor's paper was interesting in that he started with a discussion of the 19th century in which the Hungarian state very much played the role of the protector of the Jews when it came to instances of violence against them. This is the late 19th century Hungarian liberal state, which was also the one that oversaw the emancipation of the Jews. Towards the end of his paper, we see a very different kind of Hungarian state action vis-a-vis the Jews. So by 1944, he notes, anti-Jewish persecution was a state monopoly. Clearly, a lot had changed in Hungary from the late 19th century, but I find it fascinating, for instance, that both the 19th century liberals and the Arrow-Cross National Socialists consider themselves to be operating within a nationalist vein. So how did nationalism in Hungary become transformed such that the state goes from being a protector of the Jews in the 19th century to a persecutor of the Jews in the middle of the 20th? And how is it that in 1942, for example, when over 1,000 Jews and Serbs were massacred in Novi Sad or Újvidék, that someone like Endre Bajcsy-Zsilinszky stands up in the Hungarian Assembly and says this was wrong, and makes an impassioned speech against the violence that had taken place there, and he is shouted down on the grounds that he is insufficiently patriotic. So what has changed about the nature of Hungarian patriotism by the middle of the 20th century that it becomes anti-patriotic then to defend the Jews, or for that matter, subject minorities? So I would also like to talk about something that in the context of the state role vis-a-vis the Jews, something that Laszlo mentioned. He talked about how labor service battalions as institutions of the state kind of forged an inclusion versus exclusion model that we can think of in the framework of nationalism. He also alludes at the end to the changing policy vis-a-vis Jews once it became clear that the Germans were not going to probably win the war, and that those changes in views and in treatment actually were quite significant. And my question then around this issue of, let's say, the instrumentalization of subject populations for defining what constitutes the national is, what does that tell us about the state? What is the relationship between what is national and what is state? Gábor mentions that some people who had picked up weapons in 1944 were essentially these Arrow Cross thugs who picked up these weapons, and in some respects they were civilians who slapped on the guise of state actors. So when do we start seeing something as being a state action? Max Weber says that a state is an organization that has a monopoly on violence. He defines the state in that way. And so how then do we think about states vis-a-vis nations? I would also like to talk a bit about non-state actors. Gábor talks about the losers of particular transformations. And here he's talking about the 1880s, the 19-teens, the 1940s and 50s. And I would like to press him to talk about, is there, in the same way that one projects or that one has a sense of different winners over the various periods of late 19th and early 20th century, are these also different losers? And what did loss look like in the late 19th century as compared to the immediate post-World War I period or the 1940s and 50s? What did people concretely lose, and why did the Jews become a kind of a vector for or a proxy for attempts at their recovery? And can one develop a kind of typology of, to use your language, of people who lost out in these particular historical moments? And what would such a typology reveal? Rebecca speaks of how Jews in the DP camps did not necessarily want to identify themselves as Jews by nationality, and a lot of this had to do with their own experience of the Hungarian state, their experience of assimilation, and the fact that Jewish by nationality was not something that was a conceptual reality to them. And she also speaks, and there's a particular citation where one of the characters that she cites refers to emigration as almost a medical act. So there is a situation in the home country that has gone so horribly wrong that the only healthy thing to do is actually to leave. It's sort of a therapeutic move. Emigration becomes a form of therapy. And so I would like to ask, how did these decisions and the acts of things like emigration affect the way that being Hungarian was interpreted in the 20th century? And how did they contribute or not to the augmentation or the erosion of the 19th century liberal model? Laszlo talks about state actors who acted out of private motives. And when I mean specifically those who behaved in a quite corrupt fashion vis-a-vis, let's say, those in labor service battalions. And I was wondering if one can speak of corruption as having any kind of specific political valence. What is the relationship of something like corruption to some of the possibilities or not that emerged out of the 20th century? To what extent does corruption offer a kind of safety valve for persecution, and to what extent is it an exacerbator thereof? And here the comparisons between Hungary and Romania in particular are quite frequently made, and this is something that you make as well. So I would finally like to speak about ideology. So one of the striking things about the papers, and it's not necessarily surprising for people who have studied Hungarian history, but it's surprising in light of the way that the ideology casts itself, is how many episodes of anti-Jewish violence came from the left. And here Laszlo talks about post-World War I violence. The citation that Rebecca gave, the fascinating citation of the anxiety that the 15 million Jews in the US would eventually, or might eventually be the victims of another Holocaust, was as kind of capitalists, that they were in danger as a result of that. And so a lot of the anxiety about where the next persecution was coming from was also fears of the left. Whereas those who spoke about the promise of communism after World War II talked about it as a possibility to think beyond national and ethnic categories. And so I would like to ask, how is anti-Semitism related to different ideologies, and how have earlier developments influenced the course of anti-Semitism in Hungary, in particular? Laszlo talks about nationalism, and I would like to ask this broader question that I think I've posed differently before, which is, how has nationalism changed in Hungary? And here I think one can speak of the issue of exclusion versus inclusion. What did nationalism previously include that it now excludes? What did it previously exclude that it now includes? And how did that change over the course of the late 19th, early 20th, mid-20th, and up to the present day? I would also like to pose a kind of broader question to all of the panelists. The 20th century was not perhaps the greatest. let's put it that way. And I think now that it's over, we can say that with a lot of conviction. The events of the 20th century, however, they have changed a lot of things, and they might have made certain things in the future impossible. And so my question is whether or not a form of inclusive liberalism can happen after the events of the 20th century, and what would an inclusive form of liberalism look like after the events of the 20th century, including the Holocaust. And I think probably liberalism is not the best word to use. Perhaps pluralism is the better word, because even liberalism in the Hungarian context doesn't make much sense, because it's so different in the late 19th century than it is in the interwar period and again in the post-war period, and it's different in the United States than it is in Germany, and it's different everywhere. And so I think perhaps pluralism is the word that I would prefer to use. So I would like to leave it at that and turn the floor over to questions. So I encourage you, if you have questions, to come up to the microphone here, to briefly say your name, and keep the questions, to a few sentences if you can. And then we'll gather a few questions, and then we'll turn the floor over to the panelists and give them a go. Yes. So remember to say your name.
Well, thank you. Is this on? I don't think so. Oh, it is? Very good. Thank you. I'm Howard Wall from the New York area. My wife and I are longtime supporters of the museum. In fact, my wife Diane will be on her 6th trip with the museum next week to Rwanda. Clearly, we're dealing with the continuation of issues beyond the Jewish community. I wrote an article in this month's edition of the Tower magazine. Not a well-known magazine, but nonetheless, it deals with academia, liberals, certainly in the Western world, the United States, in dealing with the Jews in Israel. And what if there could be a comment upon the shift that certainly we saw in post-World War II, which was mentioned, toward the communist and liberal view of anti-Semitism, and how this has played into the tropes that continue today in terms of using Israel as the scapegoat instead of the Jewish people.
You're gathering questions,
Yes.
right? So, first I want to thank the paper givers for giving us a tremendous history lesson. But of course, I'm always trying to track the history to its relevance today. So I'd like to ask in each case the degree, for the presenters to say something about the degree to which this particular set of issues, the fact that there's a long record of anti-Semitic violence, the fact that Jews at various periods, including after the Holocaust, and I think to some extent after '56, and even today leave Hungary. And the fact that Jews didn't serve in the military in World War II. In the minds of many Hungarians, they were doing civilian service. To what extent does that history affect the way in which Hungarians look at Jews and the Jewish issue in Hungary today? And let's face it, there is a Jewish issue today. Different people would define it in different ways. But to what extent does the history shape perceptions of Jews today in Hungary?
I'm John Mary. I'm from West Palm Beach, Florida. I'm a survivor of the Holocaust in Hungary. I have one question. March 18th, 1944, there were 825,000 Jews in Hungary. Is there any historical defense for Nicholas Horthy?
Good. Yeah, we'll take one more. Good.
Hi, I'm Susan Suleiman. I'm visiting from Harvard, and I know some of the panelists, so it's very agreeable to see you all. Thank you. One thing that struck me is that Rebecca's paper seems to indicate a trend in historiography, which I have found very interesting in the last few years, which is the use by historians of private lives to illuminate larger questions. In other words, the incorporation of diaries, letters, into much broader historical reflection, I think is a relatively new trend, in the last 15 years or so. And I was wondering whether those of you like Gábor and Laszlo who work on these larger questions about, the role of labor service and so forth, whether you are also finding a trend that would incorporate, whether private lives, because I think many of us found the quotes from the letters extremely, how shall I say, satisfying, as opposed to the more general kind of historical speculation about broad significance of things like anti-Semitic outbursts and so forth. So is there a trend in Hungarian historiography right now, because Rebecca is here, to use private things or even literary works? I mean, there are some wonderful literary works that talk about labor service, for example, and I'm just wondering whether that's being done. And my other question is much more specific and just directed at Laszlo. About the labor service, I naively thought that 1944 was the worst time, but I guess not. No, 41 during the fighting in Ukraine. But would you say that there was a real policy change in 44, or is it that just by one of those historical wonderful flukes, the men who were in the labor service were not deported? In other words, they remained alive because they were not deported. So I couldn't tell whether you meant that there was a real change of attitude and policy, or whether it just happened that, although there was no change, these men were saved because they happened to not be around when the deportation orders occurred. Thank you.
So I think we have enough questions for now. We'll do a second round, so if you have questions still, please hold them for the second round, but we'll give the panelists a go for now. Can you wait till the next second round? Yes. Or are you eager to?
I wanted to add one sentence.
Oh, sure, by all means.
If you get away from large numbers and get into personal histories, what about the use of survivors? I was trying to visualize what this conference would look like for the 100th anniversary. Certainly the panel would not be different. There's not a single survivor on the panel, understandably. Survivors are not involved in scholarly work in this field. I speak on a subject on which I don't have a single refereed publication. I have lots of refereed publications in other fields, but there are still some survivors around. Is that grist to the mill, or is that individual anecdote type incidental observation totally unacceptable to the historians.
Thank you. So maybe we'll proceed in the order that we started. So Gábor, would you like to offer some, and we'll go down, and then the second one we'll start with you lastly.
Thank you. Well, Holly, you were asking what happened to nationalism between the 19th and the 20th century, and I think the answer is actually used the term inclusive and exclusive nationalism. Obviously, 19th century nationalism was more inclusive for pragmatic and from ideological reasons. The pragmatic reason, as we all know, was that the leading Hungarian elite, liberal elite, wished with the Jews to be Magyarized or Hungarianized, primarily because that would have meant, and actually did mean, that the majority of the multi-ethnic country would consider themselves Hungarian, and their identity and culture would be Hungarian. Therefore, the dominance of Hungarian culture, language, and ethnicity would be reached. Of course, that's just the practical issue. There's a lot of ideological issue. We have no reason to think that the 19th century liberal Hungarians did not think that Hungarianization of the Jews was actually a positive development from an ideological point of view. However, in the 20th century, nationalism became very ethnocentric, very exclusive, and after Trianon, after the trauma of Trianon, Hungary became a frustrated and small nation state. During and before World War I, Hungary was actually a serious player in the Central European political arena. It was not a great power, but a regional power, and after 1920 it turned into a small, frustrated nation state that quite defined the role that this nation state played in the Second World War, how and when Hungary joined the armed conflict, as you know. As far, you also asked who were the winner. I mean, what did the losers actually lose in these transformations? I think if you talk about the 19th century wave of violence, the early 1880s, you can see that those who are on the streets, those who are plundering and killing Jews, actually not necessarily the ones who were the greatest losers of the transformation. The greatest losers are, of course, the gentry, the nobility that all of a sudden lost its economic foundations due to the transformation from post-feudal society and economic system into a modern capitalist system. And although they're not the ones who are on the street throwing rocks and killing people, you can find them among those who instigated these riots. You can find them in the parliament, delivering anti-Semitic speeches. You can find them in the ranks of the National Anti-Semitic Party that was actually founded in the wake of the anti-Semitic wave of violence. However, if you take the violence wave after World War II, you can see that there's no real winners, that everybody is basically loser. It's a war-torn country, and dealing economic hardships that are basically impossible to overcome. It's a deeply traumatized country due to what happened in the previous war. So in that particular case, the ones who are on the streets, the ones who are attacking the Jews, are the very losers, of course, with the Jewish survivors and with basically everyone in the country who was a survivor of the Second World War, Jewish or non-Jewish. These are the two questions that were aimed at me, yeah.
No. Yes? Okay. Well, I want to thank Holly for the questions and the questions from all of you as well. These are difficult questions that have enormous resonance, and I'm just sitting here thinking about what kind of justice I can do particularly to Holly's questions now, but I'll put out a few ideas. The first one is this idea of how does this idea of Hungarianness, of being Hungarian, change for Jews coming from the territory of pre-war Hungary? I have done quite a lot of work on Jews who had been living in pre-World War I Hungary and then found themselves not anymore in pre-World War I, or becoming part particularly of the newly established state of Czechoslovakia. And having to continuously think in every way about what being Hungarian meant, how would they identify themselves now in a state where being Hungarian meant potential affiliation with interwar Hungary's irredentist ambitions on Czechoslovakia. It meant trying to reevaluate and reformulate the strands of that Hungarian identity, the strands, citizenship, nation, religious belonging to the territory. In the early part of the 19th century, when we think about the territory of Hungary, what it meant to be Hungarian, as elsewhere, before we see this distinctive rise of nationalism and the confluence of a nation with a specific territory, bounded territorial unit, being Hungarian meant coming from the territory of Hungary, from the lands of the crown lands of St. Stephen, as the other people called it in other languages. The Slavic peoples, for instance, called it Uhorsko, that this is just the area of Hungary, and that's where they're from. And this begins very much to change, especially after the Ausgleich of 1867, when we see Hungary pursuing a nation-state model and working toward the absorption of non-Magyar peoples. And this practice of Magyarization profoundly shaped how Jews, as well as the other peoples of the state, began to see themselves and define what is Hungarian. For Jews, there were many sets of obligations that came along with being Hungarian. I won't go through all of them now, but there's a political, social, there's a linguistic, and there was a religious obligation to what being Hungarian meant. And we can split the understanding or the division of response to that into loyalty and identity. Jews, it is incumbent on Jews in the diaspora to be loyal to the state in which they live, and this is a basic premise for how Jews live in the diaspora. The law of the kingdom is the law. Seek the peace of the city, etc., etc. And so what you do is be loyal to the state. So how were Jews Hungarian? They said that they were Hungarian. They wrote that they were Hungarian on the census. They gave their statistical support to the state. And beyond, there are other ways beyond that. So there's political loyalty, there's linguistic acculturation, which was something like a secondary acculturation, in the words of Hillel Kieval. Thinking about, there's first, Jews entered modernity through the German language, and then added other languages to it. So speaking Hungarian was a secondary acculturation in the late 19th century. So there's linguistic, political, those are the easiest. Then there was the other obligation of making Judaism modern, making Judaism Hungarian, creating Neolog Judaism. And this is something which is addressed most in the work of Jakob Katz, particularly in his book, A House Divided, which talks about the Hungarian Jewish Congress of 1868 and the enormous fractures that it created in the Hungarian Jewish community, and how this led to a division of Hungarian Jewish religion into three separate religions. There was Neolog Judaism, which was also called Congress Judaism, which was the more modernized version where you gave sermons in Hungarian and so on, to status quo anti and orthodoxy. And so there are many ways that this played out. This is just a brief sketch. And we also have to understand that Jews in pre-World War I Hungary were not a monolithic group. They did not all have the same ideas. They were not all Magyarized in the same way. We see various levels of political, linguistic, religious, and other sorts of accommodation to the state. And much of the Hungarian historiography has treated Jews in Hungary as if they were a monolithic group. And this becomes quite clear after the war when other paths are open. Okay, the ideas, I'll try to speed up a little bit here. How do we do history that doesn't enforce ideology? And this is a great question. This is something which has driven a great deal of modern historiography. It's something which is behind this term gets used quite a lot these days of transnational history, of trying to do history that moves across borders, that tries to approach questions from a broader scope that is more personal, that's more connected to the human experience, and has a less, it's less of a top-down, more of a bottom-up understanding of historical developments, including movements of peoples, changing national conceptions, and so on. So how do we do this? We think about stories of place. The stories of place. There have been ways to move away from ideology by working on microhistories, or one place. Who are the people who lived in this place, and what are their stories? We can do this. I'll incorporate that the question about private lives, talking about individuals and how they navigated systems, how they accommodated themselves, what kind of choices they made, what kind of paths they mapped for themselves. Is one way to do this also. There's comparative work of thinking very broadly, as my colleagues have done extremely well here, of thinking broadly about developments internationally. There's a story of movement. There are ways of doing this, and we'll see how effective they are. I'm still puzzling this myself to see how we can combat intensive ideologies. How do we move away from ideological history writing? As this is very important, history shapes the way we understand the world and our place in it. And so, okay, very briefly, the last one about the degree to which the idea that Jews left Hungary affects how Hungarians understand the Jews. Well, this is much broader than just the Hungarians. I mean, we see this. Jews can leave. Jews are, again, to use this word, transnational people. Jews are a global people. Jews are a diasporic people. There are Jewish communities everywhere. There's even a Jewish community where I teach in Lafayette, Indiana. You know, there are ways to think about this. That Jews had this possibility, especially during the communist period, when after this mass migration following the Second World War, Jews were the people who had relatives abroad. These were people who would get packages, who would get letters, who were in contact with the outside world, and this was suspicious. And I think that suspicion, questioning loyalty, is one way that being able to move and leaving affects how Hungarians understand Jews. And basically the loyalty, the way the state understands the loyalty of the Jews, the way the surrounding population understands the loyalty, builds the identity and then builds these further relationships.
Thank you. So it seems that this is my task to answer the actual questions. So maybe I would just really shortly respond to Holly's comments about our lectures, and then I try to answer the questions. So as for the inclusion and exclusion model, in the case of the labor service, of course, it is one of the key issues that we have to go back to the traditions of exclusionism in the Hungarian army. And already at the birth of the modern Hungarian state and liberalism in Hungary, that is the independence fight in 1848, it was one of the key issues, and actually that violence which Gábor thoroughly described in the first days of the Hungarian Revolution in 1848 erupted around the question of the participation of the Jews in the newly established Hungarian National Army and National Guard. And the question was, shall we include Jews or not? And of course the state, as Gábor showed it very well, was on the side of the Jews, but very many of the society and the armed forces thought that the Jews were not, the real members of the patriotic community, and also not the patriotic army. So therefore, Jews were excluded from the force, but later on, when the first independent modern Hungarian army was organized, the so-called Honvédség, then more than 10,000 Jews, many of them volunteers, fought heroically in this army, and actually it was a very important reference point for patriotic Jews in the 20th century. And later on, as everywhere, the army was a very important integration factor of the Jews, and Austro-Hungarian army, if compared to other armies in Europe, was more tolerant for Jews, and there were more possibilities for Jews to pursue a military career. However, it's very important to add that there was always a glass ceiling for officers of Jewish religion. So those people who could make an outstanding career, and there were many, there were 25 Jewish generals in the Austro-Hungarian army, all of them were converted. But some of them had a real outstanding career. For example, one example is, I think, a quite symbolic story of Samu Hazai, who was born in the 1850s still as a secondary citizen of the country, but after the emancipation he pursued a great career, Magyarized his name, converted to Catholicism, promoted to general, and he was the Minister of Defense of Hungary between 1910 and 17, which was of course absolutely unique in Europe, that the Jew was in such a high military rank. But despite that, Jews became the center, Jews in the army became the center of anti-Semitic attacks at the beginning of First World War, which was connected to the military failures of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy already in 1914. And instead of facing the real problems of the monarchy, it was much easier to blame, internal enemies for the failures of the army on the fronts. And Jews were accused of being dodgers, profiteers, and also ultimately the defeatists and the pacifists who caused the revolutions in the hinterland, and therefore contributed to the defeat of the monarchy in the war. So that was like the birthplace and the explanation of the exclusionism in the army after the First World War. And basically, Jews were de facto excluded from the Hungarian army during the entire interwar period. Of course, there were exemptions. Certain highly decorated and converted officers were left in the army, but the basic point was, which had devastating consequences, that the strong anti-Semitic tradition prevailed, and second, that conscription and participation in the army was always a very important integrating factor, and the common experiences and comradeship in the army was a unifying factor of society, which was absolutely missing from the experiences of Jews and non-Jews in the entire interwar period and during the Second World War. And I think it was really important to understand anti-Semitic motives of Hungarian officers and civilians. And then maybe I just turn to the questions. So the first one was the fact that 825,000 Jews alive in 1944, is it an argument on, was it like that? Did I understand it well? So was it like an argument for the defense of Miklos Horthy? So first of all, there were only about 750,000 Jews, including converts, in Hungary in 1944, which was partly due to demographic phenomena, but also the severe losses of the community due to partly the labor service, which claimed roughly 40,000 lives before the German occupation, which I already described, and also due to arbitrary actions and deportations of the Hungarian authorities, which claimed at least 20,000 lives. So there were not so many before 1944, and I wouldn't go into the very complex question of the responsibility of Miklos Horthy, but just one thing I would like to mention is that motivations are always a key issue. So the question why is the most important for us. So it's clear that the Hungarian government was resisting German demands to deport the Hungarian Jews from 1942-43 onwards. But the main motivation was that, as I already explained, that they realized that Germany most probably would lose the war, and they just reconsidered their Jewish policies and realized that it won't be possible to expel the Jews from the country, and they were actually balancing between the possible Western peace talks and the German alliance. And actually the fate of the Jews was kind of a pawn in this kind of political game. And that's why Miklos Horthy made like very controversial decisions about the fate of the Jews several times during 44. And as I've told you, there was no ultimate decision about the fate of the Jews. So there was always the possibility of deporting those people was always in the picture. That's what I think. As for the question of Professor Suleiman, how about the sources of private history? I can just talk about my project. Of course, it's extremely important to use survivor testimonies and many other sources of private history, including diaries, personal documents. So it's very valuable, especially because the traditional archival documents concerning labor service are largely missing. So I'm greatly using this. For example, if you want to trace the changing perceptions of the labor servicemen on the labor service and their military service during the course of the war, probably the best source is this frontline diaries, journals, testimonies, and other private documents. And of course, it's not only the documents of labor servicemen, but also their guards and Hungarian officers. The perpetrators of the system are very important. And of course, there was a policy change around 1942, which was symbolized by the decision of Miklos Horthy to replace the more pro-German government with the government of Miklos Kállai, which was like a moderate anti-Semitic government. The main objective of this government was to try to make peace negotiations with the Allies, and it was also reflected in the changing policy concerning labor servicemen. And the new Minister of Defense was appointed, named Nagybaconi Vilmos, Nagy Vilmos, who was like an anti-Nazi moderate officer, and most importantly, he did not consider the labor servicemen as expendables, but as like valuable economic and military units which should be like protected and used for the Hungarian war effort. And also, I think I also answered to the last question, which was about the use of survivors. Of course, survivors who are still amongst us are extremely important. We still can conduct interviews. We can listen to their testimonies and stories, and it's extremely important for us. And in fact, survivors are still very active in the research of these topics, subjects in Hungary. And of course, Professor Braham, who was the forerunner of this story, of this research on labor service, is with us. And as I've told you, his work is still the basic reference work on the subject. Thank you.
So I'm afraid we've actually run out of time, and so but I think that the answers were quite substantial. I would just like to share an anecdote that kind of ties together some of the talk about the 19th century to the discussion that, of survivors, and that is that I was interviewing a survivor last week in New York, and I went in. He invited me into his dining room, and I saw a painting on the wall, and I said, "Oh, you have a painting of Lajos Kossuth?" And he said, "No, that's my great-grandfather." It was painted in 1852, and his great-grandfather had dressed up just like Lajos Kossuth in order to be painted for the portrait. Okay, so thank you all for your participation in this panel, and thank you again for the participants and for your questions, and we look forward to the second panel.
Thank you.
Well done.